Hello again, welcome back to Peter Pan Part 2. This chapter is called The Lagoon. A lagoon is a lake by the sea, a salt water lake. And another word you're going to hear is perished. And perished means destroyed or ruined, or in the case of this story, it means to die a nasty death. Now, let's get on with the story. You'll remember that Captain Hook is after Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, but he's also scared because there's a crocodile coming after him. Meanwhile, Wendy is busy looking after the Lost Boys. Wendy didn't have a moment to waste because those boys gave her so much to do. The cooking kept her busy, and when she sewed and mended their clothes, sometimes she'd fling up her arms and exclaim, "Oh, I think that children are more trouble than they're worth." But there were adventures in Neverland, every day, especially in the lagoon. The Blue Lagoon was at the edge of the island, and the children often spent long summer days swimming or floating and playing mermaid games in the water. The mermaids never let themselves be caught, but they sat combing their hair and splashing the children if they came too close. Wendy was often at the lagoon, especially on sunny days after the rain, when the mermaids came up in extraordinary numbers to play with their bubbles. One afternoon, the children were all sitting on Maroona's rock. It was called this because the rock was submerged when the tide rose, and so evil captains put sailors there to drown. The boys were dozing and Wendy was busy sewing when a change came over the lagoon. The sun went away and shadows stole across the water. And then Wendy heard the sound of muffled oars. Peter sprang up, and with one warning cry he roused the others. "Pirates!" he cried, and a strange smile played about his face. "Dive!" There was a gleam of legs, and instantly the lagoon seemed deserted. The boat drew nearer. It was the pirate dinghy. 3 figures were in it: Smee, another pirate called Starkey, and Tiger Lily, the Indian princess. Her hands and ankles were tied, and she knew she was going to be left on the Maroona's rock to perish. Yet her face was motionless. She was the daughter of a chief, and must die as the daughter of a chief. Quite near the rock, but out of sight, 2 heads were bobbing, Peter's and Wendy's. "Ahoy there, you lubbers!" Peter called in a marvellous imitation of Hook's voice. "Oh, it's the captain," said the pirates. "He must be swimming out to us." "They're putting Tiger Lily on the rock," called Smee. "Set her free!" came the astonishing answer. "But Captain—" "At once, do you hear?" cried Peter, "or I'll plunge my hook in you." "Better do as the captain orders," said Starkey, and he cut Tiger Lily's rope. She slid into the water. "Boat ahoy!" Hook's voice rang over the lagoon, and this time it was not Peter who had spoken. It was the real Hook, who was in the water and swimming to the boat. He pulled himself into it and said in a melancholy voice, "Oh, those boys have found a mother." "Oh, couldn't we kidnap her and make her our mother?" asked Smee. "A princely scheme," cried Hook. "Yes, we shall seize the children, make the boys walk the plank, and Wendy, it could be our mother." Then he remembered Tiger Lily. "Where's the prisoner?" he demanded. "Well, we let her go," Smee answered, "on your orders." "I gave no such order," said Hook. And when Smee told him about the strange voice, Hook became worried. "Spirit of the lagoon," Hook called out, "can you hear me?" "Odds, bobs, hammer and tongs, I hear you," answered Peter in Hook's voice. "Who are you, stranger?" Hook demanded. "Are you a boy?" "I am Peter Pan. Are you ready, boys?" "Aye, aye," came from various parts of the lagoon. "Then thrash those pirates." The fight was short and sharp. A flash of steel here, followed by a cry or a whoop there. Hook wriggled overboard, and then he rose to the rock as Peter climbed it on the opposite side. Suddenly they were face to face, and Peter gnashed his teeth in joy. He snatched a knife from Hook's belt and was about to strike him when Peter saw that he was higher up on the rock than his foe, so it wasn't a fair fight. He gave the pirate a hand to help him up. It was then that Hook bit him. It was not the pain, but the unfairness of the bite that dazed Peter. Twice Hook's iron hand clawed him, but just when it seemed all was lost, Hook dived into the water. He struck wildly for the ship, his face white with fear, for the crocodile had slithered onto the rock in dogged pursuit. Well, the boys would have cheered, but they were uneasy because they couldn't see Peter and Wendy. They found the dinghy and began to row home, calling out, "Peter, Wendy, where are you?" A cold silence fell over the lagoon, and then a feeble cry, "Help! Help!" Two small figures lay on the rock, the water rising. "We have to go," Wendy said. "Yes," Peter answered faintly. "Shall we swim or fly, Peter?" "I can't do either, Wendy. Hook has wounded me." As he spoke, something brushed against him. It was the tail of a kite that Michael had made some days before. "The kite could carry you," said Peter. Well, Wendy said she wouldn't go without him, but Peter insisted. He tied the tail round her, and with a "Goodbye, Wendy," he pushed her off the rock to safety. And soon she was out of sight. Peter was left alone on the lagoon, afraid. Next moment he was smiling. A drum was beating within him, saying, "To die will be an awfully big adventure." Now the waters were nibbling at his feet. The water was rising, when he noticed an odd thing. The Never bird was making desperate efforts to reach him on her nest. She wanted to give the nest to him, even though there were eggs in it. With a mighty effort, she pushed the nest against the rock, then up she flew. Peter clutched the nest and waved his thanks to the bird. Inside there were two large white eggs. Peter lifted them up, and suddenly he had an idea. On the rock there was a large wooden stick, and on the stick the pirate Starkey had hung his hat, watertight with a broad brim. Peter put the eggs in the hat and set the hat on the lagoon. It floated beautifully. Then he pulled the stick out of the rock, placed it on the nest as a mast, and hung his shirt on it to make a sail. And then he skimmed across the lagoon. The Never bird fluttered down and sat snugly on her eggs. The hat was such a great success that all Never birds now build that shape of nest with a broad brim. Great was the rejoicing when Peter reached the home underground. Every boy had adventures to tell, but perhaps the biggest adventure of all was that they were all several hours late for bed. Now, ever since Peter had rescued Tiger Lily from the pirates, the Indians had become friends with the children, and at night they guarded their home underground against the pirate attacks. One evening, the Indians were sitting above the lost boys' home keeping watch. Inside, the children were having their evening meal, and what with all the chattering and shouting, the noise was deafening. When tea was over, the children sang and danced until at last they all got into bed for Wendy's story. Peter sat next to Wendy, looking uncomfortable. "What's wrong, Peter?" Wendy asked. "Well, it's only pretend, isn't it, that I'm their father?" "Oh yes," said Wendy a little sadly, "it's just pretend. You see," he continued, "it would make me seem so old to be their real father." Wendy nodded. Then she began her story. Once upon a time, there was once a gentleman and a lady called Mr. and Mrs. Darling. They had 3 children and a nanny called Nana. But Mr. Darling was angry with Nana and chained her up in the yard, so the children all flew away. "That's a very sad story," said the first twin. No, said Wendy, for the mother always left the window open for her children. So they stayed away for years and had a lovely time. I thought my mother would keep the window open for me, so I stayed away for moons, snapped Peter. But when I flew back, the window was closed and there was another little boy sleeping in my bed. Oh, Wendy, let us go home, cried John and Michael. Yes, Wendy said, hugging them. Perhaps it's time. Peter, will you make the necessary arrangements? If you wish it, said Peter coolly, as if he did not mind at all, which of course he did. Panic-stricken at the thought of losing Wendy, the lost boys advanced upon her threateningly. We shan't let her go, cried Tootles. Chain her up, said Nibs. But Peter would keep no girl against her will. I will ask the Indians to guide you through the woods, and then Tinker Bell can take you across the sea, he said. Oh dear boys, sighed Wendy, if you come with me, I feel sure that my father and mother will adopt you. Can we go, Peter? They all cried imploringly. Peter nodded, and immediately they rushed to get their things. But Peter stayed where he was. Get your things, Peter, Wendy said. No, he said, pretending not to care. I'm not going with you. Oh, you must come, cried Wendy. No, said Peter, no fuss, no blubbering. Goodbye, Wendy. Oh, but will you promise to take your medicine, said Wendy anxiously. Peter nodded. Ready, Tinker Bell? Tinker Bell disappeared, but no one else moved, for it was at this moment that the pirates made their dreadful attack upon the Indians. The pirate attack was a complete surprise, and the fighting ended almost as soon as it began. And sadly, many Indians perished. Only Tiger Lily and a few other warriors managed to fight their way out. Now, underground, Peter waited to hear the outcome of the battle. If the Indians have won, he said, they will beat their tom-tom drum. But Hook was listening. He was listening carefully at the mouth of the trees, and he overheard Peter's words. So he signalled to Pirate Smee, who was sitting on the tom-tom drum, to beat it loudly. Twice Smee beat upon the drum and then stopped to listen gleefully. Oh, I can hear the drum. It must mean the Indians have won, cried Peter. So, confident of their safety, the lost boys said goodbye to Peter and emerged from beneath their trees. Immediately they were taken by the pirates and thrown at Hook's feet. But Wendy received different treatment. Hook offered her his arm and escorted her to the spot where the lost boys were being gagged. The children were flung into Wendy's little house, and the pirates raised it on their shoulders and set off through the woods. But Hook stayed behind. Hook held his breath and crept towards a tree. All was silent as he stepped into the hollow tree trunk and dropped down to the home underground. There lay Peter, unaware of the tragic events above, fast asleep on his bed. Silently, Hook took a step forward. He caught sight of Peter's medicine and quickly dribbled 5 drops of a deadly poison into it. Then he wormed his way up the tree again and, muttering to himself, stole away through the woods. Peter slept on until he was wakened by a soft, cautious tapping on the door of his tree. It was Tink. Oh, you could never guess, she cried, and told him of the capture of Wendy and the boys. I'll rescue Wendy, he cried, leaping up. And as Peter leapt up, he thought of something he could do to please Wendy. He had promised to take his medicine, so he reached for it. No! Shrieked Tinker Bell, and as Peter raised the cup, she flew between his lips and the medicine and drained it herself right to the very bottom. Why, Tink, how dare you drink my medicine, Peter said crossly. But she couldn't answer. She was already reeling in the air. "What's the matter with you?" cried Peter, suddenly afraid. "It was poisoned, Peter," she told him, "and now I'm going to be dead." But then, in a voice so faint that Peter could only just make out her words, she told Peter she could get well again if children only believed in fairies. Well, Peter flung out his arms. There were no children there, and it was night time. How could he ask them? But then he thought, and he addressed all those children who might be asleep, dreaming of Neverland. "Do you believe?" he cried out. "If you believe, clap your hands. Don't let Tinkerbell die." Well, many, many children clapped. Some didn't. A few little beasts hissed. But already Tink was saved, and she was soon dashing around the room faster than ever. "And now to rescue Wendy," cried Peter. Over at Kidd's Creek on the Jolly Roger, a few of the pirates leant over the side of the ship, others sprawled by barrels over games of dice and cards, and the rest were dancing noisily. "Quiet!" Hook cried, and at once the din was hushed. "Are all the children chained up so they can't fly away?" "Aye, aye, Captain." "Then hoist the boys up." Oh, the wretched prisoners were dragged from the hold, all except Wendy. "Now then," Hook said, 6 of you walk the plank tonight, but I happen to have room for 2 cabin boys. Which of you is it to be?" "Oh, I don't think my mother would like me to be a pirate," said Tootles. "Would your mother like you to be a pirate, Slightly?" "I don't think so," said Slightly. "Would your mother like you to be a pirate, Twin?" "You boy, did you never want to be a pirate?" roared Hook, pointing to John and stabbing him, jabbing him with his hook. Oh, I did once think of calling myself Red-Handed Jack," John admitted. "We'll call you that here if you join us." "And what would you call me if I join?" Michael demanded. "Blackbeard Joe." Shall we still be respectful subjects of the king?" John inquired. "You will swear down with the king." "Then I refuse," cried John. "Well, that seals your doom," Hook roared. "Bring up their mother. Get the plank ready." Wendy was brought to him. "Silence for a mother's last words to her children," he said. Wendy was brave. "These are my last words, dear boys," she said. "I feel that I have a message to you from your real mothers, and it is this. We hope our sons will die like proper gentlemen." "Tie her up," said Hook. Smee tied her to the mast. There was an eerie silence. Hook took a step towards Wendy, but he never reached her because he heard a noise. It was the terrible tick-tick of the crocodile. "Hide me," Hook cried. The pirates gathered round him and turned away from the thing that was coming on board. But it was Peter, not the crocodile, who was making the ticking sound. Peter signed to the children not to burst into applause and then vanished into the cabin. "It's gone, Captain," Smee said, looking up. "Fetch the whip, Jukes," said Hook. The pirate Jukes strode confidently into the cabin, and then a dreadful screech wailed through the ship, and then a crowing sound. Another one of the pirates ran into the cabin, but he tottered out moments later. "Jukes is dead," he said in a hollow voice. "There's something in there, the thing you heard crowing doodle-doo." "Go and fetch me that doodle-doo," commanded Hook. The pirate went once more into the cabin, and again they all heard a screech and then a crow. Hook turned to the children. "You can fight the doodle-doo," he cried, and he pushed the boys into the cabin. But of course it was really Peter in there. Peter quickly freed them, and together they crept outside. They could see Hook and his pirates waiting on the deck, too scared to look at the cabin door. Peter reached Wendy and cut her free. Then he cried, "Down, boys, and at 'em!" Well, in a moment the clash of arms resounded through the ship. The pirates ran hither and thither. Some even jumped into the sea. Others fell by the sword. And soon only Hook remained. "Put up your swords, boys. This man is mine," cried Peter. He lunged fiercely, piercing Hook in the ribs. The sword fell from Hook's hand. "Peter Pan, who and what are you?" Hook cried. "I am youth, I am joy," Peter answered. Hook ran to the weapon house and lit a fuse. "In 2 minutes," he cried, "this ship will be blown to pieces." Peter darted into the room, came out with a bomb and flung it overboard. Hook got ready to throw himself into the sea, unaware that the crocodile, whose clock had finally stopped, was waiting. Hook had one last triumph. He invited Peter to push him overboard, so Peter prodded him with his foot. "Ah, bad form," jeered Hook, as he fell into the jaws of the crocodile. Now, far away, far from Neverland, back in the home from which the 3 children had taken flight so long ago, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were trying to get on with their lives. The only change that could be seen in the night nursery was that between 9 and 6 the kennel was not there. Mr. Darling felt in his bones that all the blame was his for having chained Nana up, and he had decided to live in the kennel. "This is the place for me," he said sadly as he crawled into it. Every morning the kennel was carried, with Mr. Darling in it, to a taxi which took him to his office, and he returned home in the same way at 6 o'clock. It was a Thursday evening. Mr. Darling was in his kennel feeling drowsy. "Will you play me to sleep on the nursery piano?" he asked Mrs. Darling as she crossed to the day nursery, and he added, "And please, can you shut the window?" "Never ask me to do that," she cried. "The window must always be left open for the children, always." Mrs. Darling went to the nursery and played the piano, and soon Mr. Darling was asleep, and he did not stir when Peter Pan and Tinker Bell flew in. "Quick, Tink," Peter whispered, "close the window, and then when Wendy comes, she will think that her mother has barred her out and she will have to come back to me." He peeped into the day nursery to see who was playing, and he saw Wendy's mother. "She's a very pretty lady, and her mouth is full of thimbles," Peter said. He did not know the tune she was playing, but he knew it was saying, "Come back, Wendy, Wendy, Wendy." "You'll never see Wendy again, lady," Peter cried, turning away, "for the window is barred." The music stopped, and when Peter peeped in to see why, he saw Mrs. Darling had 2 tears in her eyes. She wants me to unbar the window, thought Peter, but I won't. Peter could see that Mrs. Darling's tears were still there. She loves Wendy very much, he said, but we can't both have her. But Mrs. Darling could not stop her tears. "Oh, all right," Peter cried. Then he unbarred the window. "Come on, Tink," he cried. "We don't want silly mothers." And he flew away. And so Wendy, John and Michael found the window open for them. But the youngest one, Michael, had already forgotten his home. Johnny said, "I think I've been here before." "Of course you have, silly. There's your old bed." "Oh, so it is," said Michael without much conviction. "Look," cried John, "the kennel, and there's a man inside it." "His father," exclaimed Wendy. "Well, he's not as big as the pirates I saw," John said. It was then that Mrs. Darling began playing again. "It's Mother," cried Wendy. "Let's all slip into our beds and be there when she comes in, just as if we'd never been away." And so when Mrs. Darling went back to the night nursery, she could hardly believe her eyes. All the beds were occupied. She stretched out her arms, and Wendy, John and Michael slipped out of their beds and ran to her, while Mr. and Mrs. Darling agreed to adopt all the lost boys who were waiting outside. And as for Peter, he brushed against the window and called out, "Wendy, come with me to your little house." When Mrs. Darling saw Peter, she made him an offer. Wendy could go with him for 1 week every year to help him with his spring cleaning. While Peter came for Wendy at the end of the first year, he forgot to come for her the one after that, but came the next. And that was the last time the girl Wendy ever saw him. Years and years passed, and Peter did not return. Wendy grew up, she got married, and had a daughter called Jane. And one night, when Jane was asleep in her bed and Wendy was sitting on the nursery floor, the window blew open and Peter appeared. "Wendy," he said, "it's spring cleaning time." "I can't come, Peter," she said. "I've forgotten how to fly. I grew up a long time ago." And she ran out of the room to hide her sadness. "But you promised not to," cried Peter. And he sat down on the floor and sobbed. His sobs woke Jane. "Why are you crying?" Jane asked. Peter rose and bowed to her. When Wendy returned, she found Peter sitting on the bedpost while Jane was flying round the room. So Peter took Jane instead of Wendy to Neverland to do the spring cleaning. And because Peter never grew up, when Jane had her own children, they flew away with Peter too. And so it will always be as long as there are children. Peter never grew up like we do. Now, I hope you enjoyed that. And I'm wondering, would you like to fly off somewhere magical and have an adventure like Wendy, Michael and John? Where would you go? Would it be to an island where it's warm and tropical by the sea? Or maybe to a cold frozen place like the North Pole? Who would you meet there? What would you meet there? Would you have fun playing or eating wonderful food? Would there be any kind of trouble? Maybe bad, scary people or creatures? Now, we can't go very far at the moment, but of course we can go anywhere we want in our imaginations. And if you would like to write a story, and I know some of you do like writing stories, I would absolutely love to read it. And if you send your story to me at talesfromthegardenhouse@gmail.com, I could maybe read some out, and then lots and lots of people, so over 100 people or even 200 people could hear your story. If you want to do that, please do it by February the 19th, that's the last Friday of half term, and remember to put your name and your age on, and I really look forward to reading them. Have fun. Bye.